Today is Tuesday, August the 18th, and I am Pastor Marianne Kellenbach, pastor at Living Faith Church, which is located in the community of Port St. Lucie, Tradition, Florida. What a glorious day. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Today we are going to start to take a look at Luther's Catechism. Martin Luther, who was the reformer, he was seeking to reform some of the things that were happening in the church back in the 1500s, and never ever had the intention of breaking away from the church, wanted the church to acknowledge some of the wrongdoings and to reform. And I will say 500 plus years later, we can say that as faith communities, we are coming together in understanding God's grace and what God's grace is. So a catechism, catechetical instruction, is a way in which we teach the faith. So every faith tradition has some type of instruction or a catechism. And those that learn this instruction are usually those that are preparing, either if they're an adult, they're preparing for baptism. If they are a young adult and they are going to be affirming their faith, they will learn, they will have catechism. Maybe you have heard of that, catechetical instruction. And they are called, I hope I'm getting all this right, catechumens. A lot of fancy words for saying it's how we learn the basis of our faith as Christians and what is important in our view of who God is. So as Lutherans, there are components of the catechism that Luther wrote, and they're the same components basically in most of the mainline. So those are your denominational congregations. And there is, the creed, the Apostles' Creed, right? Our faith statement, the Lord's Prayer, which Jesus has taught us, the Ten Commandments, what we sometimes call the law. We certainly know there's more than 10, and what the sacraments are, the ways in which we receive God's promise to us. And so for Luther saw this as, in particular, he saw it and compared it to an illness, okay? So he's thinking of humanity. If you are ill and you go to the doctor. And he actually said that in his preface to the Personal Prayer Book, which he had written in 1522, and that came out before the Small Catechism, he compared the order in which he chose to put these basic elements of any Christian catechism or teaching. He chose to change the order. So what he did was, he said, if you go to the doctor, and the way in which you would recover from an illness. Well, first of all, you have to know that you are ill. And so he said, so you're going to receive a diagnosis of the illness. The second thing that happens is your doctor usually tells you what the source for healing will be. And the third thing is one in which your doctor will call into the pharmacist a prescription that will heal you. So that's how Martin Luther compared this illness, okay? So he said, first, you have to be diagnosed. Carl and I had been diagnosed with COVID. Second thing, what's the prescription? Okay, well, we knew what it was that we needed to do to heal. We knew what was required to heal with a viral infection. And the third thing is then actually asking for that healing. In this particular case, there was no prescription to be fulfilled. So how does Luther compare that? Well, what he says is, how do we know that we're ill? How do we know that we are sinners? How do we know this? Well, it's the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments is what he starts with. He starts with, we need to understand that we're not able to fulfill the Ten Commandments. Now, the commandments hold a very useful piece, and that's where Luther talks about, the two uses of the law. One, in civil society, we need law. The law was given to Moses, right? Moses came down from Mount Sinai. He had God's law in his hands, and that law was to teach them how to behave. Because prior to this, they were not behaving very well. And prior to that, they had been an oppressed people. They had been slaves. They had been, told how it was that they were to behave or what the consequences would be. And we know what the consequences are when you're living in a state of oppression and you are not free. Well, now all of a sudden God's people, the Israelites, the Hebrews are free. They're in the desert and they don't know how to behave. They're killing each other. They're stealing from each other. They're talking badly about each other. They're starting to worship a God other than God. They're worshiping other gods, false gods. And so, God says, here is how you are to behave with each other. You're my children, and this is how I expect you to behave. The second use, and that's why we have the law today. How are we supposed to behave in a society, as in a community as God's people? You need the civil law to have rules. Otherwise, there would be pure chaos. The second use is more spiritual. And it's the second use says, we're unable to fulfill God's law to the T, exactly as God had intended. We're going to discover that this week as we go on with these devotions. And so we understand that what the law actually does is tells us that we're sick, that we have an illness, and that is that we are not able to be perfect human beings. In fact, we are broken human beings based on our humanity and the fact that we'll always rely on ourselves. So that is the law, what we call the law, or God's commandments on how we're supposed to live. So that's the first diagnosis. It tells us that you're never going to measure up. You can't do what God is asking you to do. Okay, so what do we do now? What is it that we do then? Well, that's when we're told where's the source of healing? And the source of healing is God's grace as it's revealed in the Creed, the Apostles' Creed, where we make the confession on who God is, who Jesus is, and who the Holy Spirit is. All three together. So God's grace, that is how we come into reconciliation with God, not the commandments, but God's grace. And then finally, the very last thing is our cry for mercy. That mercy is revealed in the Creed, right? God's mercy to us. And then finally, our cry for that mercy is in the Lord's Prayer. So that's how Luther organizes the catechism. The commandments first, and then our faith statement on who God is. And then finally, the Lord's Prayer, which will differ in other faith traditions in the order in which they are and they're written. And we talked about yesterday how we are not to use the law for the purpose of guilting people to behave differently. The law is specifically used in our faith, okay, to tell us how we are unable to fulfill the law. When we gather tomorrow, we're going to take a look at that law and what Luther says about that law, because you're probably thinking to yourself, I've never killed anybody. Stay tuned for tomorrow as we continue in looking at each of the commandments. Here's what I say to you on this day. When you look and review the commandments, remember the commandments are good. They are good. But the commandments is not what makes us whole with God. Because spiritually, we discover the commandments kill any ability we think that we have to rise up to God. And that is exactly why God has come down to us and walks with us each and every single day. Go forth on this day, rejoice and be glad. And I will see you back here tomorrow. Blessings.